All right, so today I'm wanting to talk about a life dedicated to God or living for God. A life dedicated to serving Christ is what every Christian is called to do. That calling can take many forms, from something as extreme as a foreign missionary to the ordinary common citizen. But one thing the Christian life was never supposed to be is easy, no matter what place you're at with it. One of the first challenges many Christians faced was persecution and resistance from the world, and that is still very much a problem today. The world, there's always going to be someone challenging the church. Sins and temptations are another thing many Christians struggle with throughout their walk with God, and this does hinder them and may cause them to stumble many times and some to fall away. And then there are the simple worldly comforts and distractions, which very much they kind of speak for themselves. Worldly comforts, distractions, things that just steer you away from the Christian walk, or you start to get focused on other things and prioritize your own life over God's. These will always be great stumbling blocks. In fact, probably the greatest stumbling blocks and challenges in the Christian life. However, I'm not here today to talk about those stumbling blocks, but about some more subtle blocks in our walk with God. And that is the Christian life itself, or rather, aspects of the Christian life. That might not make a lot of sense to many, so I'd like to quickly ask a question. Has anyone here ever written a book? Put your hand up if you've ever written a book. I didn't think so. Has anyone here ever tried to write a book? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, there's a few people who've put pen to paper and written a short story or something, or had a bit of an idea. For the most part, in fact, unanimously, no one here has ever written a book. About 4 or 5 people have tried. That is kind of what I expected. There's a lot of reasons why none of us have ever written a book. Most of the reasons are most of us were never really interested. Some of us might have been readers, but as far as actually creating our own, we had other things we wanted to do with our life. That sounds like it would take too much time, might not be productive in the end, and yeah, there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't write a book. However, there are a few people here who have tried, and time might be, the amount of time you realize it took might have been the reason you stopped. But even the most dedicated writers still hit a problem when writing books. The writers community calls it writer's block, and it's often a problem of their own creation. Writing a book has 2 important parts: planning the book and then writing the book. And the thing is, many people who enter the writing community usually fall under 2 categories. It's usually one of those things they really liked doing, and that's why they started, but they always had a problem with the other one. So as a result, there are kind of 2 types of writers. There's the plotter. They're known in the writing community as the plotter and the panster. Now, the plotter is an author who writes plans and outlines a lot, but he doesn't really write stories. And so he's really the only one who can enjoy his world. Now, this is the one that I kind of identify with the most, the plotter. I spent about 6 years working on a world I was going to write a book series on. And after 6 years, I still haven't written anything in as far as the actual book. It's all been notes that are stuck on hard drives and stuff like that, and piles of paper in files back home, but nothing really came of it. At least nothing yet, because it's 6 and counting. I haven't given up that idea. The other type of writer is... Now, we'll talk about that later, actually. The other type of writer is the panster. You see the word pants in that, and that's because these writers are known to they have an idea for a story, and they sit down and they write. The writers call it, they write by the seat of their pants. All their writing is simply sitting in front of a computer or a typewriter and just typing. They want to get their story out there. They're the authors who write their stories without a plan or an outline. And in the year 2018, I realized I was having a problem with never writing a book. So I decided to forget the world I was working on and just picked a parable of Jesus and decided I'd write a story based on that parable. It was called Treasure in a Field. And for 4 months, I wrote a book that was I spent about 10 hours a week on this book for 4 months. I got about 15 chapters in. It was supposed to be about 25 chapters. I got stuck on a big plot hole. I realized suddenly, when I was about halfway in, the story made no sense where I was going with it. And it turned into something I hadn't really planned for it to turn into, because I hadn't really laid out a solid plan along the way, and I wasn't going back and checking. I was just kept on going with an adrenaline rush until suddenly it didn't work anymore. Well, that's the big problem. The plotters, they have a lot, that's the plotter and the panster, and the writer's blocks are usually their own creation. They write a story that doesn't work, or like a plotter, they plan a world too elaborate that they have trouble actually getting a story going. Now, living for God is a lot like writing a book. For many of us, the reasons were simply that it was too hard, and so some people didn't do it. But many Christians who do dedicate their lives to God get stuck in two areas of the Christian life. Some get stuck studying the Christian life, learning how to be a good Christian, and others get stuck living it, and they kind of forget to do the other thing. To illustrate this, we're going to look, in fact, not to illustrate this is kind of the main point of the sermon, we're going to look at two apostles, Peter and Paul. They're the most well-known apostles in the Bible, and I'm going to call them Peter the plotter and Paul the panster. And here's how this works. Peter was a plotter. He spent 3 years following Jesus. He heard the Sermon on the Mount. He saw Jesus' miracles. He heard Jesus' parables. He knew Jesus personally because he followed him for 3 years. Peter was the first to confess, "You are the Messiah." We read that in Matthew 16. In fact, in about the middle chapter of every one of the 4 Gospels, you see this story about Peter confessing, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's quite possible at that point that Peter might have even been the first Christian ever, because he was the first to confess Jesus was the Messiah. As Jesus' closest follower, he was also among the inner crowd who were chosen to witness special events that even most of the 12 didn't get to see. He was there when Jesus raised the little girl from the dead. He was here, Peter, James, and John. I believe these 3 were at a lot of specially chosen events. He was also one of the only few of these 3. He was one of the only guys who got to see the transfiguration of Jesus. So he was there for a lot of very important events in the ministry and life of Jesus. No one, if we look at it, 3 years studying under Jesus, knowing Jesus personally, no one could have been more ready to live the Christian life than Peter. Peter himself even thought this. We read Matthew 26, 31 to 35 is my first passage for today. This is at the Last Supper where Jesus is preparing the disciples for what will happen that evening. Jesus told them, "This very night you will fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, Jesus, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Well, let's see how Peter went with that. Peter was given this chance that night or early the next morning. He was given the chance to prove his salt as a follower of Jesus. So let's read Matthew 26, 69 to 75. He had just followed Jesus, and Jesus was on trial right now. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words of Jesus that had been spoken, Before the rooster crows, you'll disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Here was Peter's block. He'd been there when Jesus had said things like, "If you deny me before man, I'll deny you before my Father in heaven." Or things like, "Anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it." Or, "Take up your cross and follow me." Peter knew all of these things. But here was his block. He knew it all, but he couldn't do it. It was just too hard. He had the knowledge and the relationship with Jesus, but he couldn't live the Christian life. Who today are plotters like Peter? Our equivalent would probably be like, we're those who really like studying theology, or we love the fellowship in the church. We're all about equipping ourselves to live the Christian life. We want to learn it more. We want to surround ourselves with good friends and all that for the Christian life. But you miss the chance every time it comes up to actually be a witness for God out in the world. For example, for me, last year was my first time, because I worked on the farm before this, and then after the farm, I went to Cape and Ray to here. The workplace in Canada, and I actually have to have a real job. It's the first time I've really been in a workplace surrounded by lots of people who aren't Christians. It's quite daunting. And I've found here I could talk to you guys, I can preach sermons to you guys literally, but out in the workplace, it is so hard to try to bring up any kind of conversation like that. It's scary. It probably isn't necessarily that hard. There's a block. I just can't seem to get myself to do it. I've got a Christian friend in the same workplace as me who does a really good job. I keep missing these opportunities. My family is mostly Christian, but I have relatives who aren't. And I find I always have polite conversation about other things. It's really hard to bring up an important conversation like this. And then there's the comfort of your own home if you feel like you're called to go somewhere less comfortable to be a witness for God there. All of these things seem to pass us by and we keep on having problems. And why is that? Fear is probably the main reason. Fear of the reaction that you might get from the people. Fear of just the unknown, that you don't know what's going to happen and you'd prefer to be in control of the situation. Fear of looking stupid, of when you try to start talking to someone, you might fall over your words because you psyched yourself up too much for it and it messes up. Fear of failing to produce any fruit from that interaction. But if we don't do anything like this, all we will be are bench warmers and talkers, maybe encouraging to other Christians, but beyond that, our story is never written. The Christian life out there, being God's witness, it is very much hamstrung, trying to be God's witness out there. So how do we overcome the plotter's block? Well, let's have a look at Peter. Jesus forgave Peter. Let's read John 21:15 to 19. Yeah, so that's the one that the bookmark fell out of. Oh, well, you guys have a chance to look this one up now, as I have to find it too. Here we go. So Jesus has risen from the dead and he's with his followers, and he's back with Peter again. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus forgave Peter in this story. He gave him 3 chances to say, I love you, to make up for the 3 times he said, I don't even know you. And then, after each of those, he challenged Peter to take action. He said, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, take care of my sheep. And then after his prediction of Peter's future, he said, follow me. All of these things were going to be serious things that would characterize Peter's life from there on. But Peter had to do them. He couldn't just hear the teaching and that's good advice, Jesus, and leave it at that. And Jesus also gave him the prediction of his future. Is like, your fear is warranted. I know what's going to happen. You stretch out your hands, someone's going to lead you where you don't want to go. That was all a prediction of how the death Peter was going to die as a follower of Jesus. The fear was real. Peter was going to lose his life for the sake of the gospel, for following Jesus. But he had to do it anyway. There's also the Great Commission in Matthew 28. This was said to all the disciples, preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and the rest of the Great Commission. I think I've missed the first bit, actually. There we go. But all his followers, like Peter, they've been studying under Jesus for 3 years. It was now time for them to act upon what they had learnt, to go out into the world. And how did they go with Peter's second opportunity? Well, that happened the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came. The crowd came out of the house and they were talking in different languages, and some of the crowd was scoffing and saying, you're drunk. Well, Peter, in front of a potentially hostile crowd, stood in front of them all, and he delivered the first sermon in the Bible recorded by someone who wasn't Jesus. Well, the first sermon after the Gospels. And so there we have it. Peter overcame. He spoke to a crowd out in the world, and the Church of Jerusalem was born just like that. And that was where the Church of Christ spread. Peter, he had a lot of potential. He knew a lot, said a lot, but he had the big block that he needed to overcome, and that was to actually do something with everything he'd been learning the last 3 years. At Bribie Island, I feel like there is quite an opportunity. This is going to be a bit of a theme, old and young. There has definitely been, while I've been here the year and a half, a clear need in the youth population at Bribie. Very troubled, very lost youth. We've seen it in the youth group. There's also, it's a retirement island. There are a lot of elderly people here without their families, so they're a lonely time. But especially old and young and everyone in between, there's so many lost souls on Bribie. Do not fear the world, desire comfort above the will of God, or harbor excuses. Trust God and desire his kingdom purposes above your own. Take action. If you're a plotter, that is for you. But if you're not a plotter and you think, I've been taking action all the time, I think I'm fine, well, maybe you need to hear the second half. This is Paul the Panster. Paul's advantages. He was a man of action. Let us read Philippians 3, 4-6. This is Paul boasting for a bit, even though he's a Christian at this point. He's talking a bit about his past life, but in a kind of a positive way. Philippians 3, 4-6, here we go. If anyone else thinks he has reason to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, I was a Pharisee. As for zeal, I persecuted the church. As for the legalistic righteousness, I was faultless. That's Paul boasting for a bit about how he lived his life as a Jew, a loyal Jew. He lived a blameless life in the law. His dedication to acting out his faith was unparalleled. Paul stood out as a man of action, a man who really took what he believed seriously. In his zeal, he fought so hard for what he believed was God's will. No one was more willing to live for God than Paul. Yes, it was persecuting the church, but at the time he had the Bible at the time didn't have the New Testament. He thought that this was a very heretical thing against it, and he thought this was against the will of God, and he believed he was doing God's will in his actions. But this is where Paul faces his big problem. And like most Pansters face, it was a plot hole. And that is where we can read Acts. Did this one fall out too? All right. It is Acts chapter 9, there it is, verses 1 to 5. Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether man or woman, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." Paul found out there that all his actions were in fact working against God's plan. He was suddenly confronted with Jesus, who he saw now was God himself. And he realized all his zealous actions for God were actually going against the will of God. At best, the life he was living was meaningless, worthless, achieving nothing. And at worst, he was in fact an enemy of God. He had the passion and the willpower, but his story could not continue as it was. What he was putting his time into was actually destructive. Now, not so extreme as this, but many of us could be pansters like Paul. Taking action in the world, founding ministries, churches, or running programs. Many of us are people of action. We want to be doing something to serve God, whatever that might be. But for many of us, we run into problems. We might hit burnout, like failed churches. We might be in a ministry where nothing seems to work, or we might be running a one-man show because it's kind of our idea, but it's kind of our project rather than God's. And so we kind of want it done our way. And one person's shows do a lot of stress to the individual trying to run them, and pretty stressful to those around them as well. You're like, okay, hands off, you do it then. Others might have more negative effects. Some churches might be compromised because they see measuring success the wrong way, like they're preaching messages that attract numbers rather than actually make believers. You might end up finding yourself running an unruly youth group that you can never really talk about the gospel in this situation because it's all about crowd control, maintaining. Yes, you've got 200 youth, but what's kind of going on? I hear youth groups like that all the time. So why do some of us find we're putting all our time and energy into things that aren't really achieving anything? Some of us might be proud or unable to really be under another authority. We kind of lack the free rein and do our own thing. Maybe it's reactive or angry to you saw something done wrong and you're like, well, when I do it, I'm going to do it better or I'm going to do it different. And so you really care more about doing different to that than actually thinking which way is God's way. Maybe it's a lack of knowledge or wrong thinking, like you've just become a Christian and you're suddenly, this is so exciting, I want to live my life for God. And it's wonderful, that enthusiasm. There's certain levels you have a little trouble doing. You can't, we invite people up for testimonies maybe. You wouldn't have someone who became a Christian yesterday maybe preaching a full sermon today, although it's unusual, that could happen, we never know. The thing about the Pansters is they have trouble accepting criticism. They spend their time accepting advice, that's probably a nicer way of putting it. They spend their time telling their story rather than God's. And it often doesn't finish well. So how do we overcome a Panster's block a bit like Paul? Well, our main advice is to stop and think for a moment. So here's a bit of Paul's story. Let's read Galatians 1:13 to 19. He actually shares his testimony a bit here. There it is. All right. If you have heard my previous... Okay, so Paul's just about to kind of share his testimony a bit about how he received the gospel. You have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews in my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. But I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you that what I am writing before you is not a lie. I think I'll stop there. The rest then continues on with his ministry into Greece. So basically, what we have here, Paul spent, there was 3 years of Paul's life. We talk about that he went to Arabia, Damascus. We know very little about this time in Paul's life. And the main understanding from most scholars that I've read is it was kind of like me going to Cape and Ray. It was very probably his time just figuring out, rethinking, relearning, maybe restudying the law for himself, and just getting the right idea, basically, of what the Christian life was actually all about. This whole time he'd been fighting the church. He kind of had to relearn it from scratch. And he first took his personal journey with God out there in Arabia or Damascus, maybe doing some teaching along the way, telling others about it. And then he sought after the apostles. And it is at this point that Paul's ministry really kicks off, where he goes out as the missionary. He appears to have his personal time with God and then sought out the apostles, Peter and James, two of Jesus' closest disciples, for maybe a bit of final mentoring to prepare him for his time as an apostle himself. Finish with that page. So let's now think about this. It was a very big ask for Paul to admit that his passion and everything he dedicated his life to before that time was wrong. He had to kind of restart. But it is far better to restart your Christian journey and maybe just start from scratch than to continue and hope time will fix it, or to simply give up on the Christian life altogether. I know that for me, I did actually try that for a fair while. I can remember when I went to Cape and Ray, it was very much I wanted to relearn the Christian life, because I'd lived in a Christian home my whole life, tried to live out my faith, and I kept on failing. And I thought, do I just keep going and just hope that maybe things will get better? Or do I actually pause and actually take a moment to rethink this whole thing? But we really need to make sure that what we're fighting for or working for really is the will of God, not our own misguided agenda. So now I'd come to our final point, overcoming together. Plotters and pansters in the church, kind of like the writers' community, they don't tend to get on. They're both right in a way and wrong in a way, and they seem to be very aware of where they're right, and kind of where they're wrong is a bit of a blind spot. Plotters, they can be very harsh critics, especially of the pansters. They might call them foolish or heretics and think they're doing damage to the church because what they're doing is off. But pansters, they mostly ignore the plotters because they're like, well, at least I'm doing something. They're doing nothing. Something is always better than nothing, right? Well, not exactly, but really neither of them are right. plotters and pansters, they need each other. That is probably why Paul sought out Peter near the end before he became an apostle himself. They were together 15 days. That sounds like a pretty serious time for like some serious catch up and understanding of the gospel, comparing notes, all that kind of thing. And when we read the story of Acts, the two main human characters are Peter and Paul. And it's amazing just seeing how God uses these two men to build his church. Peter, he built and protected the core church, kind of got it started in Jerusalem, and he kind of felt like almost a kind of the head figure or the advisor. That's probably what Jesus meant by feed and take care of my sheep. And Paul dominates the second half of Acts, where the gospel and the church spread out into the world. He was kind of one of the main spearheads for that, a real action man. I think we can learn a lot from these two guys in how their combined ministries did so much for the church. So my advice, if you feel like you're a plotter, stop pointing fingers unless they're part of a helping hand. If you see something that looks like a panster is overlooking because they didn't quite do their homework and you did, well, they're doing something. Maybe instead of critiquing them, you can offer your help. Pansters, you do need to learn to take advice, seek criticism, and find wise ministry partners to help you along your way. And I think in this church, with the old and the young, there's plotters and pansters in each group, but I feel like there is a general tendency that when you're young, you're kind of full of fire and energy, and when you're old, you're full of wisdom and knowledge. It's the life experience is something that we can't really match, but you guys can't really match our energy either. So we kind of do need each other a lot. I know, I'm mean, aren't I? Sorry. There's a song. Have anyone ever heard of the band Casting Crowns? A very well-known Christian band. Yep. They've got a song called City on a Hill. And it's really a song all about all these people with different talents in the church, but they're all fighting with each other. And the song's about, it would be amazing how the church would have been, or this city would have been, if they'd all worked together and recognized the value that each other brought to the team. And one part of that song, in the line, it says, it's the fire of the young ones and the wisdom of the old, and along with all the other aspects of the song. There's, like I said, a lot of old and young in this church. And what I've also seen, something I've been very encouraged about, is there are a lot of ministries in this church. But I can kind of see there's two categories: the ministries for the elderly, and the ministries for the youth. And the ministries for the elderly have a lot of seniors kind of running those ministries. And the youth are mostly dominated by the young. But I feel like there should be a little more interaction between the two. The wisdom that comes from seniors is something that youth really need. And we only have 10 more years experience at most to many of the youth in the youth group. And you're not even old enough to be their parent. It's hard to tell them what to do or give them advice and that kind of stuff. And for the young, I actually got a chance to be at Cape and Ray. We had to do a compulsory ministry thing on the side, and I chose a nursing home. I got 2 got 2 hours a week in a nursing home, working alongside the chaplain. And I'm sure I wasn't necessarily anything special. It was just that I was a young person and the chaplain was an older guy. The elderly people just loved chatting with me and having me play the piano and talking about their life. They loved it. And I heard a rumor about last year that the youth group might have benefited a fair bit by when Ray had to temporarily run the youth group for 2 weeks. Apparently, there's quite a big change happened. I think that kind of authority none of us could ever wield in our 20s. Ray sounds like you might have helped things out a bit there, so go Senior Ray. Anyway, so I reckon there needs to be a lot of work for the plotters and the pantsers. If you feel like you've got wisdom to offer some wisdom and help out the people who are on fire running the ministries. And help out each other in your own. I think that's a really important message we can help each other overcome so much of our pitfalls in our own walk by being a little more connected. So I'd like to conclude. Plotters, let Jesus be your motivator and go try to live the Christian life out there. Pansters, let Jesus be your guide and get to know the life that you're supposed to be living. Both of you, find out how to appreciate, learn from, and help each other. And finally, for all of us, let Jesus be the one who writes the story of our life, who writes the story of the church as well. So that's what I'd like to leave you with, and so thank you all for listening.